we're answering the call of God. And so what I want you to know is that we started last week talking about the book of Isaiah. And the book of Isaiah was talking about the call of Isaiah. And we looked at chapter 6, verses 1 through 10. And if you are here, or if you've had a chance to listen to the video, I think I finally got the video fixed. So hopefully it'll get uploaded. We've had a few problems recording. But if you don't have a Bible with you, the notes have all the Bible verses in it. But we're going to be talking about Moses tonight. And we're going to look at his call. And his call is very different from Isaiah's. Moses' call, he doesn't react the same way Isaiah does. And so we have what they call the burning bush experience. Now understand that every believer seems to think that they should have their own burning bush experience. But God responds to each of us uniquely and differently. And it doesn't mean that all of us are going to hear from him in the same way. Sometimes it's something we read, sometimes it's something somebody else says that God uses to touch our hearts or to open our minds. Sometimes it's a physical manifestation. I can't tell you how God will reveal himself to you other than I know that he reveals himself through prayer and through reading his word. And if you read his word, you know that's basically how we come to know him, is to spend more time with him. But Moses, at the very beginning, you need to understand some things. Moses was born, and almost everybody knows the story of Moses. So I'm going to give you kind of some brief details. Moses was born at a time when Israel was in slavery in Egypt. They were there, and they were waiting for someone to come. To come and lead them out of Egypt to the promised land that God had promised Abraham and his descendants. And so Moses was miraculously hidden in the water because the Pharaoh realized how many Hebrews there were, and he wanted to get rid of them. And so the way he figured he'd do it is he'd have all the boys killed that were born, all the male children. And so every male child born was supposed to be strangled in their crib, basically. But that didn't work because he had depended on them, and they refused to do it. And so, they found all sorts of ways to hide the children. And one of those children was a kid who became known as Moses. His mom figured that the way to save him was to put him in a basket and float him out into the river. And the princess, the daughter of the Pharaoh, happened to be bathing in the Nile right there, and this crib this basket floats up, and there's a baby in it. And so she pulls him out. She names him Moses, which means drawn from the water, and she raises him. And so Moses, being Jewish, is being raised in the Pharaoh's household. And for the first 40 years of his life, he does everything. He learns the language, he learns the politics. He was the beloved, adopted son of Pharaoh, but he still knew who he was. He still knew because when the Pharaoh's daughter decided that she couldn't raise a child herself because she hired Moses' mom to raise the child. And so Moses' mother was being paid to take care of her son by the Pharaoh's daughter. Now, I know all of you sort of know this story, and most of you know this story, but the reason I'm getting to this is because at the age of 40, he decided he was going to make a difference. And so Pharaoh saw a Egyptian guard punishing some Jewish slaves, and he intervened. And in the process, he ended up killing the Egyptian guard. And later that day, he heard somebody say, well, be careful with him because he might kill us like he did the Egyptian guard. And he realized that what had happened had gotten known, and so he ran for it. And he went and lived in the wilderness for the next 40 years. And at the age of 80, one day, he's walking. Remember now, this is a guy who spent 40 years raising sheep in the wilderness. It's not like the wilderness is going to be surprising to him. And God decides it's time. And so in Exodus 3, verses 1 through 4, we read this, and 1 through 4. Meanwhile, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire within a bush. As Moses looked, he saw that a bush was but not consumed. So Moses thought, I must go over and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning up? And when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, here I am, he answered. Now, I want you to picture this. I know people say, well, maybe it was an imagination. Maybe some people say, well, maybe this is just a fictional story. Well, I'm going to point out some couple things. Number one, first and foremost, Moses was raised in the wilderness. He wouldn't have seen something like a bush burning and not known what it was. Okay? He lived in a wilderness area. He'd spent 40 years as a shepherd. He was learned. He learned to read and write in the Egyptian schools. So this is not, an ignorant fool. This is somebody who was very intelligent. And he sees this bush burning and he realizes there's something different here. And when he walks up to it, he hears a voice call out to him, Moses, Moses. And here I am, he answered. Now, officially, that's Moses' call. We could stop there and say, okay, we've learned about how he was called. But there's a few problems with Moses' call that I want to point out to you. See, what he heard was, don't come any closer. He said, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. Then he continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt, and I have heard them crying out because of the oppressors. And I know about their suffering, and I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them out from the land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of the Canaanites, the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way the Egyptians are. Now, until verse 9, Moses knows the stories. He's been raised by a Jewish mother. He knows everything there is to know about the history of his people. And he looks up, and God appears, and God says, I'm about to rescue them. I've heard their cries. I've heard their misery. And at that point, I guarantee you, Moses was excited. Moses was thrilled to death. God is going to finally rescue them. Now, understand, the reason God had waited so long is there's a verse back in Genesis where he says it's not the time of the Canaanites. He's going to give them another 300 years to repent, which is why the Israelites ended up in Egypt for 300 years, because God was waiting for them to have an opportunity to repent. The Canaanites were giving an opportunity before they were destroyed to repent That's right there in the book of Genesis, and if you ever want to look it up, I'll find it for you. I don't have it right off the top of my head, but there's a verse in there that says that the time of the Canaanites is not yet. And so he says, do not come any closer, and he's all excited about this, and then God hits him with the last verse. Verse 10, therefore go, I am sending you to Pharaoh, so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And I think Moses probably said, whoa, wait a minute here. Let me put it this way. You're sitting in your desk one day. You're sitting in your house one day. And an angel of the Lord appears to you. Now, first off, it's an angel. You're going to fall at your feet because you're going to be afraid. Because every time you find an angel in the Bible, he always, first words out of his mouth are, do not be afraid. But in this particular case, since it's God calling out, in all likelihood, who Moses saw was Jesus, the pre-incarnate Jesus, because nobody saw God the Father. But Jesus said that himself. Nobody's seen God the Father except he's seen the Son. So, here we have Moses is talking to God, and God says, oh, by the way, I've heard all this stuff. I'm going to do something about it. I'm sending you. You're my solution. You're the answer to this. And Moses is like, whoa, wait a minute. God, you know who you're talking to? I mean, we have the same reactions. When God called me in the ministry, that was the first thought in my head. God, do you know who I am? I mean, do you realize how ill prepared I am to be a pastor? I mean, how could you possibly think that this would be a good idea to call me into the pastorate? I mean, I'm not an eloquent speaker. I'm not good with people. I'm not gregarious and outgoing. How could I possibly do what you call me to do? Why would you send me? Basically, what Moses said was, "But God, but God, I am nobody." And Moses asked God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And he answered, "I will certainly be with you, and this will be the sign that you have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Number one, God calls him. Moses says, "Who am I to go? I'm nobody. I'm not any value." And God says, "I'm not sending you to do it by yourself. I'm sending you to be my spokesperson, just like God sends us." Same thing God told me. "Hey, Mike, I called you, but I'm going with you." "But God, I don't even know your name. I mean, who are you? I know you're God of Abraham, but what's your name?" And Moses asked God, "If I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what should I tell them?" And God replied to Moses, "I am. This is what you are saying to the Israelites. I am has sent you." Now, let me stop and pause right there a second. The great I am. Jesus said, "I am the way and truth and life." But in the Hebrew, the word there has become transliterated into Yahweh. Now, we don't really know how it was originally pronounced, because sometime during the first Babylonian captivity, the Israelites stopped saying his name because they decided to take that verse about don't take the Lord's name in vain, and by using his name at all, they figured they were taking it in vain, so they stopped using it. So what they did, and if you knew anything about Hebrew, and it's a little hard to explain, Hebrew is a bunch of consonants, and they have something called vowel points. And so what they took the word Adonai, which means the Lord, and they added the vowel points to the word Yahweh, which is the four letters YHWH, and made the word Yahweh. That's where we get the word Yahweh, and in the Greek it became the word Jehovah. That's where we get the Greek word Jehovah. But what it means, it is a word uniquely used for God, but it is saying I am, I was, I will be. I'm everlasting from past eternity, from everlasting to eternity future. I have never had a beginning, and I will never have an end. And I am present in the past, the present, and the future. God reveals his name to Moses. He reveals his nature, his character. It's what they call a covenant name. It's the name that God covenanted with Israel people, the people of Israel, to be his chosen people, by giving them his name. God also said to Moses, "Say this to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is how I am to be remembered in every generation. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I have paid close attention to you, and have what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised you that I will bring you up from the misery of Egypt in the land of Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to what you say. Then you, along with the elders of Israel, must go to the king of Egypt and say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now please let us go on a trip to the wilderness so that you may sacrifice to Yahweh our God. However, I know the king of Egypt will not allow you to go, unless he is forced by a strong hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles that I will perform in it. And after that he will let you go. And I will give these people such favor in the sight of the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. Each woman will ask her neighbor and each woman staying in her house for silver and gold jewelry and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters, so you will plunder the Egyptians. Now, I want you to call attention to a couple things. First off, he's saying, hey, look, they're going to listen to you. I'm giving you my name. This is what you're to tell them, and the elders will listen to you. They're going to hear what you said, and they're going to know that who I am, and they will listen. And you will go to the king, and the king of Egypt will refuse. And then we will stretch out our hand. Now, Moses has gotten two very big promises. Number one, I'm sending you, and I'm going with you. Number two, here's my name. This is who I am, Moses. Moses says, oh, but God, elders won't believe me. Now, I'm not sure whether Moses was paying attention, but he missed that part about when God gave him his name and he said, the elders will listen to you. God has already told him this is going to happen. Why? But we do the same thing. God will say, this is what I'm calling you to do. This is where I'm sending you to minister. This is what I want you to do here. And we'll say, well, but God, oh, but God, I couldn't possibly do that. It doesn't meet with my work schedule. I'll miss Law and Order on television. I don't have time for that. My cat's having a birthday party. Okay, so I'm being ridiculous a little bit. But what I'm trying to point out to you is that we start making excuses just like Moses did. Oh, but God, who am I? Oh, but God, who will I say sent me? Oh, but God, the elders won't believe me. Listen to 4:1-9. And Moses answered, what if they don't believe me and will not obey me, but say the Lord did not appear to you? The Lord asked him, what is in your hands? A staff, he replied, and he said, throw it on the ground. He threw it on the ground and it became a snake, and Moses ran from it. The Lord told him, stretch out your hand and grab it by the tail. So he stretched out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. This will take place, he continued, so they will believe that Yahweh, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, appeared to you. In addition, the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And so he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took out his hand, it was diseased, leprous, and white as snow. And then he said, put your hand back in your cloak. And he put his hand back. And when he took it out, it had again become like the rest of his skin. If they will not believe you and will not respond to the evidence of the first sign, they will believe this evidence of the second sign. If they don't believe even these two signs or listen to what you say, take some water from the Nile and pour it out on dry ground. The water in the Nile will become blood on the ground. Now, he's already told him once, Moses, the elders are going to believe you, and this is what you're going to do. And he's arguing with God about, well, what if they don't really believe me? What if you're wrong, God? You know, God, you're calling me to this, and you're sending me into this, and I'm wanted for murder back there, God. You know, don't you realize who I am? You're sending me back to Pharaoh and to Egypt, and I don't trust you. Because that's really what he's saying. God, I don't believe you. I don't believe they're going to listen to me, and give me some signs. Give me some proofs. So God gives him 3 signs. Now, does he run off and say, okay, great God, I've got this handled now. Thank you. You've met my doubts. Thank you so much. No. Next one. Oh, but God, I do not speak well. And Moses replied to the Lord, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, either in the past or recently, or since you have been speaking to your servant, because I am slow and hesitant in speech. And Yahweh said to him, who made the human mouth? Because I am... Who makes him mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? Now go, and I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say. But look, guys, I got news for you. God created you. If God calls you to do something, guess what? He knows you better than you know yourself. All those years ago, when I started arguing with God, wanted to tell God, "Oh no, this couldn't possibly be me. I'm so worthless and I'm so useless. How could you possibly want me as a pastor? How could you possibly use me? I'm not good at talking. I'm not good at that kind of stuff." I spent 2 weeks arguing with God. And I finally said, "You know what, God? I'm open enough to believe somebody else needs to confirm it." At the time, I didn't realize what an insult I was telling God. "Oh, I don't trust you enough to do what you're calling me to do." And I said, "God, I'm going to go talk to Dan Hurst." Dan Hurst was my youth pastor, the associate pastor of the church I grew up in. And so I walked in the office and I sat down at the desk and I made an appointment with Dan and went in to talk to him. I didn't even get a chance to make my excuse. You know what? Dan Hurst looked at me, not even missing a beat. And he says, "Michael, I'm so glad. I've been meaning to come and talk to you. God has been laying it on my heart that He's called you in to be a pastor. He wants you in the ministry." My mouth hit the floor. God had already had it taken care of. The hard part sometimes is learning trust. "Oh, but God, I don't speak well." Who cares? I made you. I'll give you the words to say. This isn't you. The best thing I can say is that God called you. He will give you what you need to do it. And He will be with you the whole way. God doesn't tell Moses, "Okay, you go on to Pharaoh and tell him, and I'll sit here and you come back and tell me what happened." No. He says, "Moses, I'm sending you, but I'm going with you. I will be with you every inch of the way, and none of this will happen outside of my control." And then verse 13, chapter 4, Moses said, "Oh, please, Lord, send someone else." "God, send someone else. I don't want to go, God. I'm not called. I'm not going to obey. I don't trust you." But, God, please send someone else. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And He said, "Isn't Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well, and also he is on his way to meet you. And he will rejoice when he sees you, and you will speak with him and tell him what to say, and I will help both you and him to speak and to teach you both what to do. So he will speak to the people for you. He will be your spokesman, and you will serve as God to him. And take this staff in your hand that you will perform the signs with." God is a patient, caring God who loves us dearly. But when we spend all of our time debating and arguing with Him, it reaches a point where we lose something. You see, we know a little history now. We know a little bit about Moses. We know about what happens here. But we ask ourselves, what does that have to do with us? I mean, God's never shown up in a burning bush in my house and sent me to do something. Well, folks, I'm going to tell you right now, if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, you are on mission. Matthew 28 says, "Go, and as you are going, make disciples, baptizing them in my name, and teaching them to obey my commandments." Oh, wait a minute, God. That's for the pastor, right? That's for the guys who are in... No. It's not just to me. It's not just, oh, that's part of my job too. to proclaim the gospel and to make disciples. But if you are a Christian, you're on mission. God has called you to make disciples. Every last believer is on mission. Every last believer is called to be on mission. So we can run around and say, "Oh, but God, I can't do this," or but God, I don't know how, and but God, I don't believe you, and but God finally says, "Go." This isn't. I'm giving you an option. This isn't giving you a choice. You know, one of the things that I find is Moses lost something in that step. God was going to send him alone. Now he's sending Aaron with him. Aaron's going to go in and help. Aaron's going to be the spokesman. God calls us to obey. Not because it's to his benefit. We're called to make disciples for our benefit. God says, this is what I have for you to do. This is what I've called you to do. You obey me. You obey because you love me. If you read on from this point in the Old Testament, and you read the whole incident with the Pharaoh, and you realize they're in this, I want you to notice something about Moses' leadership. He struggles with those he leads because he started his call in rebellion. You see, God knows who we are when he calls us. He's not surprised. God didn't look at me and say, "Well, no, Mike, I didn't realize you're a good speaker. I didn't realize you weren't gregarious and outgoing. Michael, I called you because this is what I called you to. This is how I gifted you. This is how I prepared you. This is what you're going to do. I didn't do this." I'm not like God was surprised. Just like he's not surprised at you. God knows you better than you know yourself. Nothing is hidden from God. God isn't running around saying, "Well, I wonder what Morgan's like. I wonder what he's thinking right now." None of you are outside of his view. He knows you utterly and intimately and completely. And when he calls you, he's not saying, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that." God's not sitting up in heaven going, "Well, I wonder if I should call so-and-so, because, I think maybe he might do a good job." He knows you. Number two, God reveals himself to us. God says, "Hey, you know what? Yes, I told you to go, but I'm revealing myself to you, me." Because that's the whole purpose of the call. Is for you to reveal me through you to others. God isn't saying, "I want your talents and your gifts and your special abilities. I want you to be faithful. I want you to be faithful. I don't care about the results." That's the big difference between Isaiah and Moses. Moses is told, "Hey, the elders are going to listen to you. They're going to obey. They're going to do what you tell them to do." "Oh, but God, what if they don't?" They will. "And I'm going with you, and I'm giving you the signs, and you're going to go." Remember last week we talked about Isaiah? What was Isaiah's response? "Who will go for us? Here am I, Lord. Send me." Not, "Well, but God." No. Here am I. God created us, folks. He created you. He knew you before you were born. He knows you. Utterly and completely. He knows your weaknesses. He knows your strengths. But it doesn't really matter what you can do. It's a matter of what he can do through you. You know that? That God makes a way that God created you. He knows everything about you. There's not any surprises. God calls each of us. And when we reject that call, sometimes God gives us what we want. But I'm going to tell you right now, if God relents and lets you go your own way, it is never a blessing. That much I promise. He doesn't say, sometimes God lets us have our way. Okay, you're on your own. You do your own thing. But that's never a blessing. It's never going to be something that's good for us. And when we rebel against God, we sow the seeds of rebellion in others we influence. Maybe it's our spouse, maybe it's our children, maybe it's our employees. But when we rebel against what God calls us to do, when God says, this is what I'm sending you to, this is where I'm sending you, this is what I want you to do, and we say, oh, but God, you run that motorboat across the lake going, but God. When we rebel against God's call, God says, you sow the seeds of rebellion because you showed your children or your employees or your fellow employees that you don't trust God and you're not going to obey Him. Look, guys, when God calls, He says, this is what I intend for you. This is where I intend you to go. Not, this is an option you have. I created you. I made you. I know what you're capable of. I am so glad that God was patient with me. And this is really scary to realize. I have been in ministry for 32 years. God called me when I was 24. I haven't always understood. But I am secure that He called and that He's used me. I'm glad that He made me available. Just like He's calling you to be available. God created you, knows you, God reveals Himself, and God calls us to be faithful, not just the results. He told Isaiah, and Isaiah saying, here am I, send me. Was Isaiah? He does Isaiah, they're people not going to listen to you. I'm sending you to a people that aren't going to pay attention to one word you said. When He called Ezekiel, and He said, Ezekiel, this is what I'm going to do. And He does all this stuff, and He says, by the way, I'm sending you to a hard-headed people, and they're not going to listen to one word you say. Moses, God says, they're going to believe you. And Moses is going to argue with God, well, no, what if they don't? So when God calls, what's your response? Are you going to respond like Moses? Oh, but God, I've got this to do, or I've got that to do, and I've got all this to worry about. Or is it, here am I, send me. Here am I, God. I will serve where you call me to do. Please understand me, guys. The Old Testament saints, they're human beings just like the rest of us. They made mistakes. They did good things, they did bad things. They all did. Because, just like you and me, they are sinners in need of salvation. Their salvation was based on what Jesus was going to do, and they knew. They believed and trusted God that that's what he was doing. We have a historical event. We can look back and say, this is what God has done. And then while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. Guys, it isn't a matter